Okay, so you guys have been sending in some seriously interesting research lately, and there's a theme I've noticed. It's all about how we learn best, especially how to schedule our study time to, actually make that knowledge stick.
Yeah, definitely seeing that too. Lots of interest in optimizing those study sessions for the long haul.
Exactly. So, for this deep dive, we're going to tackle that head on. We're diving into these studies to uncover the best ways to plan your study time for maximum retention. Because who doesn't want to remember more of what they learn?
For sure, and one big idea that pops up over and over in this research, it's something called the spacing effect.
Spacing effect. Okay, tell me more.
Basically, it means spreading out your study sessions over time, putting some space between them. And the research shows it's way more effective for long-term memory than cramming everything in all at once.
Ah, so instead of pulling those all-nighters before a test, we should be, what, like revisiting the material bit by bit over time?
Exactly. And studies show this can lead to significantly better long-term retention.
Interesting. But here's the thing, and I'm definitely guilty of this myself. Even knowing spacing is better, most of us still end up cramming. I mean, it's almost like a reflex to try and absorb everything in one go, especially when a deadline is looming.
Yeah, it's almost like a natural instinct. And that's kind of the puzzle we're going to unpack in this deep dive. Why do we gravitate toward cramming even when the science points us towards spacing? And more importantly, what does that mean for how we approach learning in a way that actually works?
Right, because knowing the best approach is one thing, but actually using it is a whole other challenge. So let's get into it. Where do we even begin with all this research?
Well, the sources actually point us back to the roots of this idea, to the evidence that first showed us how powerful spacing can be. And it starts with a guy named Hermann Ebbinghaus way back in 1885.
1885, that's like the dawn of memory research, right?
Pretty much. He was a pioneer,
Yeah.
and his research method was fascinating. He studied his own memory using nonsense syllables, basically random strings of letters.
So not exactly the most relatable material. How did he even remember any of that?
Well, that was the point. He wanted to study pure memory, free of any prior knowledge or associations, and his findings were amazing. He found that when he spaced out his study of these syllables over 3 days, he needed significantly fewer repetitions to relearn them later compared to cramming them all into a single day.
So even with gibberish, spacing was more effective.
Exactly. And his conclusion was super clear. If you've got a lot to learn, spread those repetitions out over time. It gives you a real edge.
Okay, so that's one study. Way back when? Did other researchers find similar results?
Oh yeah, this is just the beginning. Just a little over a decade later, in 1897, Jost, another researcher, came up with his law of forgetting.
Law of forgetting sounds ominous.
It's not that bad, really. It basically says that the older a memory is, the more it benefits from being revisited. The longer you've known something, the more likely it is to fade.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Like, I probably don't remember what I had for breakfast last week, but I definitely remember my 10th birthday party.
Exactly. So spacing, by its very nature, means going back to information after some time has passed. And that lines up perfectly with Jost's law because it helps reinforce those older memories that are starting to get fuzzy.
So it's like giving those memories a tune-up before they disappear completely.
Exactly. And it gets even more interesting. By 1928, we even had the first meta-analysis on the spacing effect.
Meta-analysis. Remind me what that means again?
It's basically a study that combines the results of many other studies to give you a bigger picture. So in 1928, Rooch, the researcher behind this meta-analysis, looked at over 24 studies and found this consistent advantage of spacing.
So not just one or two studies, but a whole bunch of them were pointing to the same conclusion.
Right, and this wasn't just a small, isolated thing. The research shows that the spacing effect happens across the entire lifespan. Think about it, from babies learning about objects to adults picking up new skills. It's there.
Wow, all ages. That makes this spacing thing seem pretty fundamental to how our brains work.
Totally. And a big goal for many of these researchers was to see these findings actually used in schools, to change how we educate. But that's where things get a little, well, tricky.
Tricky how? You'd think with all this evidence, schools would have jumped on the spacing bandwagon ages ago.
You'd think so, right? But it's been surprisingly slow to see spaced practice become the norm in education.
Why is that?
Well, Delaney and his colleagues wrote about this in 2010, and they pointed out that teaching often follows a really linear path. You cover one topic, then move on to the next, not much revisiting. And exams are usually non-cumulative, so there's no real push to remember stuff from earlier.
Right. It's like that feeling of closing the book on a chapter and moving on without looking back.
Yeah. And Rohr, another researcher, noticed a similar thing in math textbooks back in 2009. Topics were usually presented in these big chunks instead of being spread out.
Interesting. So the way we organize learning materials might actually be working against the spacing effect.
Exactly. And Vosh, in 1989, had a kind of cynical view on this. He suggested that maybe education policy avoids space practice because it's untidy. It doesn't fit neatly into those lesson plans.
Untidy. Harsh. But I can see the point. Spaced practice probably feels less structured, less predictable than just getting through a topic and moving on.
Right. And because of this slower uptake in education, a lot of the research on spacing has focused on individuals in controlled settings, using stuff like those nonsense syllables, lists of digits, or words. And while those studies were important, nobody's really excited about memorizing word lists, right?
Totally. So the real challenge is taking this knowledge about spacing and making it useful for real-world learning. Like, how do we actually apply this to things we care about?
Absolutely. And that's what makes these sources you sent so interesting. They're digging into the how and why of spacing so we can figure out how to make it work for everyone.
Okay, so we've established that spacing works, the evidence is strong, but how does it work? What's going on in our brains that makes spacing so much more effective?
Right, and that's where things get really fascinating. There are some really cool theories that try to explain this. One of them came out of research by Bjork and Allen back in 1970. They found that something really important happens the second time you study something, but only if it's spaced out.
Okay, what happened?
Well, they found that if there's a challenging task between the first and second study sessions, the memory encoding during that second session is actually stronger. It's like your brain has to work harder to recall the information, and that effort actually makes the memory stronger.
So struggling a little bit is actually good for long-term learning. I kind of like that idea.
Right. It's called desirable difficulty, and there's a whole body of research on it. Cuddy and Jacoby, Glover, all these researchers found that the harder it is to recall something because some time has passed, the stronger that memory becomes in the long run.
I could definitely relate to that. It's like when you have to really think hard to remember something and then it just clicks into place, it feels more satisfying. And I do feel like I remember those things better later.
Exactly. It might not feel as easy as just immediately reviewing something, but that struggle is actually key.
Makes sense. What are some of the other theories about how spacing works?
Well, there's this really cool one called contextual variability. It's the idea that when you study something at different times, you're usually in different environments, maybe a different time of day, different location, even just a slightly different mood. And all those subtle differences get encoded along with the information, giving you more cues to help you remember it later.
So, like, if I only ever study in my quiet bedroom, my memory of the material might be really tied to that specific place. But if I also review it in a cafe, at the library, on the bus, I've got all these different triggers for that memory.
Precisely. It's like building multiple pathways to access that knowledge.
That's a great way to think about it. So I've got desirable difficulty and contextual variability. Are there any other explanations for the spacing effect?
Yeah, another big one that comes up in the sources is the expanding study schedule. Landauer and Bjork really pioneered this idea.
Expanding study schedule. What does that mean?
It means gradually increasing the amount of time between your study sessions. So you might review something after a day, then after 3 days, then a week later, and so on.
Oh, so instead of just spacing things out consistently, you're actually stretching out the intervals over time.
Right. Initially, it seemed like this might have extra benefits, but as more research came out from Belota, Carpenter, Call, and others, the results were a bit mixed, and there's a reason for that. A lot of these studies used a specific type of testing where you had to recall information without getting any feedback.
So if you couldn't remember something after a long gap, you were just stuck.
Pretty much. And without that feedback to correct yourself, that memory wasn't very likely to magically reappear later.
That makes sense. Feedback is important.
Yeah.
But were there any studies that looked at the spacing effect over really long periods, like months or years?
Yes, and one of the most compelling examples comes from a 9-year study by Barak and his team on learning foreign language vocabulary.
9 years. That's serious dedication to research.
It is, and they found something really interesting. While the space study felt harder and slower at the beginning, it led to significantly better long-term retention, even up to 5 years later, compared to massed study.
Wow, 5 years. That's way beyond any final exam.
Exactly. And in their research, they actually quoted another study by Schmidt and Bjork, who said, manipulations that maximize performance during training can be detrimental in the long term. Conversely, manipulations that degrade the speed of acquisition can support the long-term goals of training.
Okay, break that down for me. What does that even mean?
It means that just because something feels easy to learn doesn't mean you'll remember it later. In fact, the easier it feels, the more likely you are to forget it quickly. It's like that feeling of acing a quiz right after cramming, but then drawing a blank on the exam a few weeks later.
Ouch, I've been there. So feeling challenged during studying might actually be a good sign for long-term learning.
Exactly. And then there's another interesting theory called the deficient processing theory.
Deficient processing, like our brains aren't working properly.
No, not like that. It's more about how we pay attention. Researchers like Bregman, Cuddy, and Jacoby and others found that when we cram, we tend to get habituated to the material. We see it over and over in a short time, and we don't process it as deeply each time.
Because it's just so repetitive.
Exactly. But with spaced study, each time we encounter the material, it's a little bit like seeing it with fresh eyes. We pay more attention and process it more deeply.
Oh, I get it. It's like that annoying sound outside your window. If it's constant, you eventually just tune it out. But if it stops and starts, you notice it every time.
Exactly. And the sources emphasize that all these benefits of spacing aren't just about remembering facts and concepts. They actually apply to learning physical skills too, what we call motor learning.
Really? So like playing an instrument, learning a sport, those kinds of things.
Exactly. And this was a bit of a debate for a while. Early on, some research suggested that the spacing effect might be more important for explicit memory, like remembering facts and events, and less relevant for implicit memory, the kind involved in motor skills.
Because those skills become more automatic. Like you don't have to think consciously about how to ride a bike once you've learned it.
Right. But the research shows that spacing does benefit motor learning. There's early evidence from the early 20th century showing the benefits of spacing for learning things like navigating mazes, typing, archery, even throwing a javelin.
Wow, so this spacing effect goes way back.
Yeah, it does. And more recent research has solidified those findings. Lee and Genovese, for example, did a meta-analysis on motor learning studies and concluded that massed practice actually hurts both your immediate performance and your long-term learning.
So just drilling a skill over and over without breaks is actually counterproductive.
In the long run, yes. And there's this classic study from 1978 by Baddeley and Longman with postal workers learning to type.
Postal workers learning to type. That sounds like a fascinating study.
It was. They found that the group who had the most spread out practice, just 1 hour a day, actually took the fewest total hours to reach a certain typing skill level. But here's the catch. The overall learning process took longer.
So it's a trade-off between feeling like you're making fast progress and actually learning the skill efficiently and for the long haul.
Exactly. And they also found that doing more than a certain amount of practice in a single day didn't lead to any further improvement. They called this laboring in vain.
Labor in vain, like hitting a wall where you're just not absorbing anything anymore.
Precisely. It's similar to the idea of overlearning in cognitive tasks, where studying something even after you know it doesn't necessarily make you remember it better in the long run.
Oh, I've definitely felt that, especially when cramming for an exam. You just reach a point where your brain is fried.
Exactly. Now, one thing to remember is that motor learning is complex. How you measure learning can influence the results. For example, in one study, spaced practice helped people complete tasks faster when they were relying on verbal instructions. But massed practice was better when they were learning by actually using the software themselves. So the type of learning and how you measure it matters.
So there's nuance to this. It's not just a blanket statement that spacing is always better.
Right. And there's another important difference between how cognitive and motor learning studies are often done. Cognitive studies usually involve learning multiple things mixed together, while motor studies often focus on repeating a single skill with different timings.
Okay, so setup of the studies is different.
Yeah.
How does that affect our understanding of spacing?
Well, it brings in the idea of contextual interference, which is huge in motor learning research. It's all about the difference between blocked practice and random practice.
Blocked versus random. Explain that.
Okay, imagine you're learning 3 similar motor skills. Block practice would be like practicing one skill over and over, then moving to the next, and so on, like really focused, massed practice. Random practice, on the other hand, means mixing those skills up, so you rarely do the same one twice in a row.
Okay, I'm seeing the difference. So which is better?
Well, research shows that blocked practice often leads to better performance during the initial learning phase. But here's the kicker. Random practice leads to much better long-term retention.
So once again, that initial feeling of doing well can be deceiving. It's the long-term results that matter.
Exactly. And this contextual interference effect has been seen across a huge range of motor and even cognitive tasks badminton serves, rifle shooting, understanding logic gates, using ATMs, solving math problems, even learning to identify different artists' work. When you're learning multiple things, that mixed and spaced out exposure seems to be the key.
So the takeaway here is mixing it up, even if it feels harder at first, leads to better learning in the long run, whether it's physical skills or mental knowledge.
Absolutely. And now, shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about how this all applies to different ages and learning environments. Does the spacing effect hold up for kids, and what about in actual classrooms, not just lab settings?
Right, because kids' brains work differently, and classrooms are, well, a lot more chaotic than a research lab.
For sure. But the research is pretty clear on this too. The spacing effect is definitely present in young children across a whole range of memory tasks. Studies by Cahill and Topino, Rea, and Modigliani, Seabrook and his colleagues, they all show the benefits of spacing for kids of all ages.
So it's not just an adult thing.
Nope. And get this, there's even evidence of the spacing effect in infants.
Infants. Seriously. How do you even test memory in babies?
Researchers use clever methods that track their attention, and they found that babies show stronger memory for images they saw with spacing compared to those they saw repeatedly in a short period.
Wow. So like built in from day one.
It seems that way, but there is a little caveat. One study by Topino and his team found that while spacing works for intentional learning in kids from preschool to college, it actually reverses for very young children when it comes to incidental learning. You know, the stuff they pick up without even trying.
So for really young kids, they need to be actively trying to learn for spacing to work its magic.
That seems to be the case. Now, moving to classrooms, the research is also encouraging. There are tons of examples showing that spacing is super beneficial for learning across different subjects. Math facts, reading comprehension, science concepts, vocabulary, you name it. And it even works for 5 to 7-year-olds learning science.
So it's not just about the material, it's about how it's presented. Space practice can make a real difference in the classroom.
Absolutely. And one idea is that spacing helps kids process the material in different contexts, just like we talked about earlier. By revisiting concepts at different times, they're encountering them in different ways, and that strengthens their understanding.
Right, connecting it to different activities, different examples, different ways of thinking about it.
Exactly. And here's where things get even more interesting. Spacing is also linked to something called the testing effect.
Testing effect, what's that?
It's the idea that actively testing yourself on material actually helps you remember it better in the long run. Remember those expanding practice schedules we talked about? Those often involve self-testing. And overall, research shows that testing is a seriously powerful learning tool. It likely boosts the benefits of spacing even more.
So space study plus regular self-testing.
Mhm.
Sounds like a winning combo.
It really is. However, it's also important to acknowledge that the spacing effect isn't a magical solution that works perfectly in every classroom study. One of the early reviews by Dempster pointed this out.
Okay, so there are exceptions.
Not so much exceptions, but more like nuances. One big factor is whether we're looking at immediate performance or long-term retention. As we've discussed, cramming can sometimes lead to better recall right after you study.
Because it's fresh in your mind.
Exactly. This is explained by something called the proportionality rule, which says that if you're tested very soon after studying and the gaps between your study sessions were short, cramming might seem better. But if the test is further out, spacing wins hands down.
Makes sense. So if I have a pop quiz in an hour, cramming might be okay. But for the final exam weeks later, spacing is the way to go.
Precisely. And Sapita and his colleagues did some great work illustrating this. They created a temporal ridgeline that visually shows how the optimal spacing interval changes depending on how long you need to remember the information. If you meet it right away, less spacing is better, but as the time until the test increases, longer spacing intervals are best for recall.
So it's like adjusting the spacing to match your learning goals.
Exactly. But even their analysis found that even with super short test delays, less than a minute, spacing was still slightly better than cramming. A real advantage for cramming only happened with insanely short delays that you wouldn't normally see in a classroom.
Okay, that's reassuring. It means that for most real-world learning, spacing is the more effective approach.
Definitely. And one last point about all this is that most of the research happens over pretty short time frames, minutes, seconds. But real-world learning takes place over days, weeks, months, even years.
Right. It's not like we're just trying to remember something for a few minutes. We want knowledge that lasts.
And the good news is The benefits of spacing have been shown to hold up over those long periods. Studies on learning maps, foreign languages, history facts, typing skills, math concepts all support this. One study even found that just repeatedly reading something in a short time wasn't any better than reading it once.
So the takeaway is clear. Spacing is a powerful tool for long-term learning.
Absolutely. But here's the big question that keeps coming up. If spacing is so good, why don't we all do it more?
Yeah, it's kind of a head-scratcher, isn't it? Why do we still gravitate towards cramming when we know spacing is better?
This takes us to the world of metacognition. It's all about how aware we are of our own learning and how we make decisions about how to study.
Sort of like thinking about thinking.
Exactly. And the research generally says that people, even adults, actually prefer to study in a massed way.
Really, even when they know it's not the best strategy.
Yeah. Remember that study with the postal workers learning to type? They learned best with space practice, but they hated it. They much preferred cramming. And in another study, people learning a motor skill preferred practicing it all at once and even wrongly thought that this would lead to better memory later.
So we're not very good at judging what actually works for long-term learning. We focus more on how easy or quick it feels in the moment.
Exactly. Learners pay more attention to their immediate performance during study rather than how well they'll remember things later. That makes them pretty bad at figuring out what actually works.
So our gut feeling about studying can be totally misleading.
Yep. Early research even suggested that we're not great at deciding how to use our study time effectively. And more recent studies show that students often think rereading is better than self-testing, which we know isn't true. And they also tend to believe that cramming is more effective than spacing.
Wow, so much for trusting our instincts.
Right. But there's a bit more to the story. Sun, a researcher, did a study in 2004 where college students could control their own study schedule. And she found that they actually did space out their study more than half the time.
Okay, so maybe there's hope for us after all.
Yeah, it's interesting. And what's even cooler is that they spaced more for the easier stuff and crammed more for the harder things. And when they followed their own spacing choices, they did better on tests.
So maybe they had some intuition about when spacing was helpful?
Maybe. But here's the thing. The same researcher did a study with younger kids, first graders, and they just crammed everything, no matter how easy or hard they thought it was.
Okay, so maybe younger kids haven't developed that awareness of spacing yet.
That's one possibility. And similar results were found with third and fifth graders. They preferred cramming, but when researchers made them space their study, their test scores improved.
So for younger kids, maybe it's not so much that they don't understand spacing, but that they have other reasons for preferring to cram.
Exactly. And there are a few ideas about why this might be. Cramming feels like less effort in the moment compared to spacing, where you have to go back and retrieve things, which can feel harder. Also, stopping studying when you feel like you're just getting started and planning to come back to it later might seem counterintuitive.
Mm.
And kids might not be that motivated to do that later review.
It's like they want to get it over with rather than dragging it out.
Yeah. And some research even suggests that the way studies with kids are designed, like having a done button, might encourage them to stop too early.
So it's a mix of wanting to avoid that initial difficulty, not fully grasping the long-term benefits, and maybe just wanting to be done with studying.
Right. And Sun, the researcher, also suggested that using spacing effectively might need a better understanding of time and future planning, which is still developing in younger kids. But interestingly, even those first graders who crammed everything for long-term study did use their judgment well for short-term choices, like deciding whether to reread or test themselves right away. So it seems like spacing over longer periods might be the tricky part.
It's a complex skill. So to sum up this puzzle of why we don't space more, it seems like younger kids prefer cramming, maybe because it feels easier and they don't fully get the long-term benefits. College students might be a bit more savvy about when spacing works, but there's still a lot to learn about how different people make these study choices. The good news is that encouraging spacing, especially in younger learners, helps them learn better, even if it's not their preferred method.
Absolutely. And all of this has big implications for how we approach education. The main takeaway is that spacing study is the optimal way to learn things well for the long term, whether you're a teacher or a student. While cramming might seem better for really short-term memory or for initially grasping a concept, spacing wins for long-term retention.
Okay, so what does this mean for teachers and for us as learners? How do we put this knowledge into practice?
For researchers, the work continues. They need to keep investigating how spacing works for different subjects and materials and figure out those rare cases where it might not be the best strategy.
And for teachers in the classroom, how do they actually implement this?
Well, the research suggests a few things. Teachers should stay updated on the research on spacing and think about incorporating more review sessions and even ungraded quizzes. Quizzes can actually be fun for kids and help with that spaced retrieval practice. Also, creating a more varied learning environment, like through team teaching, different examples, and encouraging diverse problem-solving approaches, can support spacing. Of course, all of this has to be balanced with the reality of limited time and a packed curriculum.
Those are definitely real challenges for teachers. So what about us, the learners? How can we use spacing outside of the classroom?
Well, that's where we have more control. For homework or personal study, try to actively mix things up and space out your practice. In subjects like math, instead of just doing all the problems on today's topic, throw in some problems from earlier lessons. And across all subjects, when you're planning your study time, try to revisit old material along with new stuff, even if it feels a little harder at first.
So it's about actively creating those spaced retrieval opportunities, even if they're not assigned.
Exactly. And the research also emphasizes the importance of being mindful of how you're studying. As a learner, try to think about your methods and why you're choosing them. Even just jotting down your plan, am I going to just read, reread, test myself, space it out, can increase your awareness. For younger students, teachers can encourage this by asking them to explain their study strategies. It helps the kids become more aware and helps teachers see how their students' learning skills are developing.
So it's about bringing that metacognition, that thinking about thinking, into the learning process.
Exactly. And for specifically adding spacing into homework or self-study, one effective technique is trying to summarize past lessons after some time has passed. This creates that desirable difficulty of retrieval, and you can adjust how long you wait based on your understanding. If you're struggling, review more often. If you feel confident, wait longer.
So it's about tailoring the spacing to your own needs.
Precisely. And one final crucial point, remember those misconceptions we talked about. That feeling that cramming is better because it feels faster and easier. We need to be aware of that. While explaining the difference between short-term and long-term memory might be tricky for very young kids, older elementary students can definitely grasp the idea, and teachers and parents can try to make that challenge of retrieval more fun through games or computer-based learning that provide feedback and reward good strategies.
Lots of great tips there. So to wrap up this deep dive, what's the big takeaway message for our listeners?
The message is loud and clear. Space learning is a seriously powerful tool for remembering things over the long term. It's supported by tons of research across all ages, different learning situations, even for physical skills. But we often have this natural instinct to cram, which can feel good in the moment but doesn't lead to lasting memory. So recognizing this bias in how we think about learning is essential for making smarter choices about how we study.
Absolutely. So for our listeners out there, think about how you can start using these ideas of space learning in your own lives. Whether you're prepping for a big meeting, learning a new skill, or just exploring something you're curious about, spacing can make a world of difference.
And on that note, here's a thought to ponder. If our natural instincts sometimes lead us towards less effective learning methods, what other hidden biases might be shaping how we approach learning in all areas of our lives? It's worth reflecting on where else our initial feelings might be steering us off course in our quest to understand the world around us.